Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Eric Olson. I'm the Senior Associate here at the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And we're very proud and thankful that we have assembled a top-notch panel of experts to discuss what we think is one of the most pressing issues in Mexico, but also in U.S.-Mexico relations and how our two countries relate to one another. And what is particularly important, I think, from our perspective, is that there's a constant drive here in Washington and in Mexico, for obvious reasons, to come up with a policy response to a problem. But sometimes that policy response and the urgency of it gets a bit ahead of the analysis and the understanding of the phenomenon that we're trying to respond to. And so in an effort to dig deeper and look more fully into the issues of insecurity and violence and organized crime in Mexico, we have invited a number of scholars, researchers, former government officials, to help us look more fully into what is causing the dramatic increase in violence in Mexico. Why is Mexico been faced with such a dramatic killing spree? We know the numbers are somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 in the last 5 years. But what is behind that violence? Who is doing the killing, and why are they doing the killing? It's not self-evident that it's just a matter, the result of criminal activity. Most criminal networks and illicit networks and economies trafficking goods try to avoid extreme violence because it's bad for business. So what is it that's driving this violence in Mexico, and who's behind it? We've fallen into an easy pattern, I think, sometimes of slapping on names to this phenomenon, such as a cartel, or insurgencies, or terrorists, or organized crime, without necessarily understanding more fully what is at stake in Mexico and how then we should respond. This is not the end of that discussion, hopefully the beginning of one, but we've invited 3 experts that will help us dig deeper into the phenomenon and understanding what it is. And then we've invited Mark Kleiman, who I'll introduce in a minute as well, to talk about some of the new ideas and some of his own ideas about how one might approach this phenomenon in Mexico. Some of the steps Mexico could take and some of the steps the United States might take that would try to change that dynamic. So let me introduce our speakers. I am going to begin with Alejandro Hope. Alejandro is the project director for the Less Crime, Less Punishment project, or MC2, at 2 organizations, 2 think tanks in Mexico City, the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness and Mexico Evalúa. Prior to his current position, he held various management positions in the Mexican's civilian intelligence agency, CISEN, and he's also held a number of consulting positions in what is one of Mexico's leading political and economic consulting firms known as HEA. Following Alejandro, we will hear from Marcelo Bergman. Marcelo is a former Woodrow Wilson visiting scholar, and he is also a sociologist and professor at the Department of Legal Studies at CIDE, one of Mexico's leading research institutions and universities. He's a level 3 member of Mexico's National Research System, and he has a BA and MA degrees from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a PhD from the University of California at San Diego. And last but not least, I want me to introduce Mark Kleiman, is professor of public policy at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, and he's on leave and a visiting fellow right now at the National Institute of Justice. He received his BA in political science, philosophy, and economics from Harvard University, and his PhD in public policy from Harvard, where he taught for several years. He's also the author of numerous books. Suddenly blanked on the name of the book.
Brute Force Fails.
When Brute Force Fails, less, what, more?
How to have less crime and less punishment.
How to have less crime.
Stole it from Alejandro.
Yeah. And then most recently a book on drug policy. All you want to know about U.S. drug policy.
Drugs and drug policy, what everyone needs to know.
Right.
And I assure you the arrogant subtitle was Oxford University Press, is not mine.
Yeah. Well, I really recommend that book if U.S. drug policy or drug policy in general is a new issue for you, because it's done in a very sort of question and answer kind of way, and it really helps you grasp a lot of the complexities, contradictions, difficulties in drug policy. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to ask Alejandro. Oh, I'm sorry, a small announcement. We are, there's simultaneous translation, very good simultaneous translation.
Amen.
And there are hearing devices in the back. And so some of our, I think, are you all going to do this in English? Or
We'll try.
We'll try, okay. But if you did need to do it in Spanish, or you have questions you want to put forward in Spanish, this will be a bilingual session. Okay? Alejandro?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much to Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you very much for everyone here for coming here, taking some bit of time to listen to what we have to say. Yes, indeed, I plagiarized the name of the project from Mark Kleiman, but I think it's for a good cause. Let me try to tell you where we're coming from with this. The default position in thinking about Mexican criminal organizations is that they are large, well-structured, well-organized, hierarchical type of organizations. And pretty much everyone believed when I started looking at this, that was pretty much the position that I was in. And then I started doing some research. And as part of the research, we found out about some cases that are pretty interesting. One of which was this guy who was arrested in Baltimore for dealing relatively low quantities of cocaine. And but the guy was picked up as part of this large sting called Operation Accelerator that, according to the Department of Justice, had taken down a large distribution network of the Sinaloa cartel. So when this guy went to jail, and he was tracked down by a couple of reporters. And when asked, "So are you a member of Sinaloa cartel?" the guy said, "Sina who?" So the guy didn't have a clue of what organization he was supposed to belong to. So that kind of what our interest of seeing. So what type of animal are we dealing with? Let's start with the size, with relative size in terms of income. These are some of the traditional or some of the available estimates of drug income that is accruing to criminal gangs in Mexico from exports to the U.S. As you can see, there are pretty large numbers, from about $14 billion to about 39. Actually, the first one, ONDCP, was actually disavowed by ONDCP when they started using this number for the pro-legalization crowd in California started using this number. Anyway, but so we don't know much about these numbers. We don't know where they come from. We don't know how they were calculated. Actually, the NDIC number, actually, the only explanation is one single footnote in the National Drug Test Assessment 2009 that said, well, we calculated this number by multiplying the volume that we think is sold wholesale in the U.S. by the price we think those drugs were sold at. But we don't know how they came up with that volume number. We certainly don't know where they came up with the price number. And the ICE number no clue where that come from. But that does not mean that they're wrong. So let's try to unpack this and let's try to look at some of the components. Last year, RAND Corporation, the Drug Policy Research Center at RAND, came up with a very interesting report on the impact of marijuana legalization on Mexican drug exports and violence. And they came out, as part of that, they came out with a estimate of how much drug export revenues were accruing to Mexican gangs. And they came up with a best estimate of around $6.6 billion, with a range of about somewhere between 5 and 8. My team and I, we ran the numbers. We put a couple of tweaks. The numbers updated some of the estimates, and we came up with more or less the same thing, between 4.7 and 8.1 billion dollars, with a best estimate of about 6.2, which is like pretty much the same thing as what RAND found. But this is not the whole story. Why isn't the whole story? Because there are several missing pieces here. This is gross export revenues, but one, they still need to pay for the drugs. And that would give them net drug export revenues. Secondly, they're probably getting some revenue from whatever drugs they're selling in Mexico. And then you would have to add whatever they're getting, what type of revenues they're getting after importation into the U.S., after the smuggling act into the U.S., what type of revenues they're capturing and repatriating into Mexico from distribution networks in the U.S. That gives you total drug income. Then you get total non-drug income, and then ultimately that's the total income. There are two big game changers here. One is non-drug income. We don't know how big that is, but there are some indications that it's likely a fraction of whatever they're getting from drugs. How little a fraction? Well, that's open to discussion, but it's likely still something of a fraction. But the elephant in the room here is how much money they're getting from distribution networks within the U.S. Why is that such an important piece of information? Because, rule of thumb is that import prices are about are about 1/10 of retail prices. So the difference between what you're getting from import and what you're getting at the retail level is about like a 10 to 1 differential. So the more you get into the distribution network, the more you're capturing. So we don't know for sure how much of that they're capturing, and it's very difficult to observe directly. So why don't we go? What I tried to do is I made the assumption, maybe this is the wrong assumption, but I made the assumption that if 20, 30, or $40 billion were actually coming into Mexico from illicit drug exports, that would show up in the data. What type of data? Well, let's start with balance of payments. There's in the balance of payments that every country publishes a thing called the errors and omissions account, which is everything that is not that the central bank or the statistics board, whoever does those balance of payments numbers, don't know where they came from, what type of transactions. There are some transactions that we don't know what they are. So that would be a good place to look at. This is an inverted scale. So what we get is that over the past decade, more or less, the errors and omissions account show a deficit of about $4 billion. Dollars leaving Mexico, which arguably could be drug dollars that are then exchanged into pesos and then sent back to the physical dollars then sent back to the U.S. And of course you do see a bump right at the end, but you're still pretty far from the 19, 20, and 29, $39 billion range that are usually thought. So I don't think we see that here. Then if the money was coming into Mexico, arguably you could see some impact in the peso exchange rate. About $20 billion is about the same size of migrant remittances. Whenever the Central Bank of Mexico intervenes, because there's a lot of instability in the market, they spend like $100 million a day in of international reserves to stabilize the market, and it does have an effect of stabilizing the market. So if that amount of money was coming into Mexico from illegal sources, you can really bet your mortgage that would show up in the exchange rate. Is it? What would one expect? One would expect that if large inflows of foreign currency were entering the Mexican economy, that the Mexican peso would revalue significantly and consistently. Do we see that over the past decade? Well, no. What we see is a 20% devaluation, more or less, since 2000. So maybe the money. Okay, the money may be getting into Mexico, but it's never changed into pesos. Okay, let's assume that. Then let's assume then it is deposited in the country's banks. Let me give you some sense of this. $20 billion is about 2% of GDP, Mexican GDP. Over 10 years will be like 20% of GDP. So do we see some accumulation of that? Do we see some evidence of that in the Mexican banking system? Well, not quite. Because what we see is that the commercial bank deposits as a percentage of GDP have hovered somewhere between 15 and 19% of GDP. So if the drug money is entering Mexico, it's probably not going into the banks. How about real estate? Do we see it going to real estate? If it were going into real estate, most likely it will show up. Why? The Mexican construction sector is worth about 6% of GDP. About half of that is infrastructure. Out of the remainder half, 3%, about two-thirds is housing. So you have a housing sector that is about $20 billion. So if they were really pumping the money into real estate or into housing, you would kind of see it in the numbers. You would see it in housing prices. Do we see it? Well, not quite. In the state that has seen the fastest growth in housing prices over the past 5 years, that growth has been 5%, which means that price would double in 14 years. This is the fastest growing state. And it's one that is not particularly connected with drug traffic. Are they in the national level? It's 1.8%, not exactly California pre-2006. So not in housing. So how about the stock market? So arguably, the Mexican stock market is worth about $500 billion. That's market capitalization. Again, if bad guys are pumping in 10, 20, 30 billion, that should probably be visible. The Mexican market should be significantly outperforming some of its peers in the region. And well, what else hasn't? Because it's pretty much tracked Brazil over the past decade. And it has slightly outperformed a bit Chile, and it has underperformed Argentina. So is drug money going to stock market? Maybe not. So what? I don't want to belabor this point, but the issue is that those massive inflows of drug money that are allegedly coming into the Mexican economy are not present in any aggregate data that I could find. So that probably means that they really do not capture the income after importation. Of course, they might capture that and leave it in the U.S., but that has an interesting implication. It would mean that they're giving most of their income to people over whom they have pretty much zero leverage. It's not like they can kill bankers in Wall Street. Anyway, if that's the case, if they're not capturing it, then what comes out of that is that probably the levels of vertical integration are probably much less marked than what we usually attribute them. And that also is as the sense that we get from information about drug-related state and federal inmates in the U.S. This is a table that comes from a paper by Jonathan Calkins, Eric Savigny. This data is a bit old. It's about 2004, but still I think it's interesting because if Mexicans were really controlling the distribution networks within the U.S., they would arguably be overrepresented in drug arrest, and particularly in drug arrest for wholesale type of violations. And you don't see that in the data. Neither Mexicans nor Mexican Americans, more or less, they're arrested. 10% of all drug-related arrests are Mexicans or Mexican Americans, which is more or less the percentage, the percentage of Mexican and Mexican Americans in the U.S. population. So either the operatives of Mexican DTOs are super elusive and they're never caught, or else it's probably the case that they don't really rule the roost. There are not vertically integrated, hierarchical, rational, unitary actors that have tentacles across the globe and can move humongous quantities of money across the planet. So what are they? Well, there are many things. And that is kind of the final point, which is think of this in terms of a taxonomy whereby one dimension is what type of activity they're involved in. Whether they're involved mostly in illicit traffic or whether they're involved mostly in rent extraction. What is rent extraction? One is, extortion, kidnapping, robbery, you name it. Taking something from someone by the point of a gun. And then you have the guys that pretty much trade in illegal merchandise. And then you have another dimension, which is whether they're local, whether they're transnational, whether they're export-oriented or domestic-oriented. So what you get is a quadrant with it's a structure with 4 quadrants, whereby you have, in the upper right corner, you have the traditional smugglers, people that move drugs from point A to point B. Then you have people that pretty much deal in drugs and other illicit merchandise or services within Mexico. Then you have the people that are mostly in the extortion, robbery, kidnapping business within Mexico. And then you have, which are the muscle men, and then you have guys that do pretty much the same thing, but with kind of like a transnational twist, meaning they're in the border, they're prison gangs and things of that nature, or people whose main line of business is kidnapping Central American migrants. Most of the action, there are 2 things that are important. First, the traditional smugglers, that has been the core of Mexican organized crime for the past 7 decades. That's probably a declining sector. Why? Because to the extent that cocaine consumption in the U.S. has been declining, the revenues of these guys are probably also declining. In terms of future and present and future Mexican security concerns, most of the action is down here. It's in terms of the extortionists, in terms of the extortionists, the kidnappers, and things of that nature. So what you have is and some of this is not a very neat picture. There might be gangs that are all across the board, like the Zetas or the Templarios. You might have people that are very, very specialized, and there might be the Zetas and the Templarios or other gangs trying to extort from the extortionists. And trying to control some criminal networks. So that might be the case, but the issue is that this is more complicated. So let me conclude here let me just give you 3 conclusions, 3 implications. 1, the conventional wisdoms about the size of Mexican organized crime is most likely wrong. They're probably smaller than we think. Secondly, it's more useful to think of this in terms of a network than in terms of vertically integrated hierarchical discipline structures. Third, what you have is this is an ecosystem of crime where you have many different life forms. It's highly diversified, and to think of this in terms of transnational criminal organization probably tends to obscure that crucial fact. And the implication that over the long run, these are not organizations that will take over the Mexican state. This is not a long-term threat to Mexican national security. What is it? It is a very immediate threat to the life, property, and security of a large portion of the Mexican population. So the key issue is about law enforcement. It's about reestablishing some semblance of order in many regions of the country. So there are two things that need to be done, and I leave that here. One is that we need to better leverage the federal and U.S. resources to create, to reestablish a low violence equilibrium. And secondly, we need to be better at mobilizing local responses. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Marcelo, I think you need to be over here, though.
Te muevo si quieres, yo te lo muevo. O aquí, la puedes mover con este, ¿no?
Yeah, you can do that. You want to open it? I'll open it. Can you open this, please? Yep. Gum. Chewing gum.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, the Wilson Center and the Mexican Institute. It's a great opportunity to be here. I am actually pinch hitting for Eduardo Guerrero, that he was supposed to be here, but apparently he could not, and he could have presented a wonderful story about the development of violence in Mexico. I will not, because I'm not an expert on that, but I will come to ask questions more than providing answers. Because I don't, but something puzzles me. I belong to the category of the researchers and not the political or policymakers, so I cannot give good proposals, but at least I like to study those. And my question basically is, well, how come so sudden violence happen in Mexico that diversify in different kind of activities, not only people executed or killed? Usually what we do in Mexico, or what most researchers do in Mexico, is go and get the data for homicides that's being released by newspapers or by the government, or et cetera, et cetera. And that provides a picture for something, but not for everything. It reminds me something that I teach my students on the first classes of methodology, and I will tell that story. Probably you hear about the chewing gum, the bazooka chewing gum. Do you remember those when we were young? At least when I was young. They came with a cartoon. Do you remember that? Well, I remember one cartoon long time ago. It was Joe Bazooka walking on a street during one night, and he see a fellow looking for something on the street. And he approached to him, and he asked him, what are you looking, buddy? Well, my ring fell. Okay, so he tried to help, and he said, well, it's this ring fell here, not just around the corner. So why you are looking at here? Well, because there is light here. So usually what we do is looking at the data that not necessarily give us the response that we are, sometimes we do research with data that it does not satisfy us. So what I'm trying to, I call it that the bazooka syndrome, that we very much, academics, we all fell into that. So we will try to avoid, and the first step is asking questions. So what kind of data we should look for? And fortunately, there are good PhD students or scholars that are trying to look for different for other data. Well, having said that introduction, I will get to the main part, which is the questions. Well, my main question is the following. Why large organizations that make zillions of dollars will get involved in petty crime? Doesn't make sense that for them will get involved. Why the Sinaloa cartel will get into extortion? You will see numbers, doesn't make sense. So in that case, if that hunch or that proposition exists, so who is doing what and why? We don't have good answer, but I will try to go and give you some suggestions or propositions what is happening. Let me pass very quickly this. This is the basic rent structure of cocaine. There are different models, but more or less it will give you an idea that the big money is being made in this side of the border, or in Europe, where it's being retailed at a very, very high fraction of what is being wholesale once it crosses the border. So you will say, well, the big money is being made in the US or Europe. Well, not necessarily, because this is the structure that resembles like an hourglass of the business. The majority of the people that work in the business are the producers that get pennies for their production of the coca leaves. On the other side, there are thousands and thousands of small dealers that work on the street selling their drug, or just lately not in the streets by cell phones, but you get the picture. In the middle, there are the traffickers or the smugglers. But the smugglers are few. There are not many smugglers. This is not a very open, competitive market that everyone can be a smuggler. It's very tough to be a smuggler or a transshipment. So you have few organizations, very powerful, that concentrate in the key part of the business, which is taking the drug from production and put it close to warehouse where it can be distributed relatively easy. So that part of the business is being carried out by the so-called cartels, that would prefer the term drug traffic organizations, and there are few, but they are making a lot of money because they make 20% of the rent, but divided among very few players. Now, what is that? Okay. Let me give you just a resemble of the data. This is from 1990, the homicide trend, and the spike since 2007, and there are much better pieces or graphs than this one. And this is the historical trend for Mexico. It goes only into 2005, but as you can see, its homicide indeed was coming down, but all other crimes, here I put only theft, but most of other crimes went up. So crime was increasing in Mexico, and the reasons why homicide was declining before has to do, it doesn't have, it's not related to the criminal justice system or any problem, but the process of urbanizations after the Mexican Revolution. Now, I'm going to get data for recent crimes. This is kidnapping, reported kidnapping, and it's probably, there's a lot of misreport, but it gives an idea that it went up about, well, you can see the numbers, tremendously. Extortion, 3 times. Total theft with violence, almost, for instance, if you take the auto theft with violence, it doubled from 2004 to 2010. So we are not talking about here only on homicide. We are talking about full enterprise, and these are crimes that create a lot of rents. Who is doing this? That's my question. Now, let's think about extortion and kidnapping. I'm running some numbers. I make estimates. Not very accurate, but it provides a good idea. So if you take extortion or kidnapping, it will take 50,000 kidnaps or extortion per year to equal 10% of the rents that produce the cocaine trade. Doesn't make sense for Chapo Guzman to get involved in this messy, because it still takes a lot of work to kidnap and extort. Let me talk about the domestic market for drug consumption that can be a source of violence. Well, here it's interesting because cocaine indeed went up. It almost doubled from 1.2% of the population that ever used cocaine to 2.4%, double in only 6 years. Now, we are working on a paper that shows also age groups that the increase is very, very important, particularly for cocaine. As you see, this is marijuana, and this is cocaine. Okay, so cocaine was almost very little non-important in 1988. 2008 really picks up. It's still not the numbers in the U.S., but it's important. We are estimating that it's about a 20, let's say 20 metric ton. It's a very inaccurate, but it gives you an idea. So it's about 10% of the U.S. market of cocaine. But the key part here is not the size, but the rate of change, the dramatic increase over the last 5 to 6 years. And that has to do a lot with the violence, I will say later. Same story with synthetic drugs, large increases. This is being done through surveys, addiction to alcohol and drugs, general population surveys, and adjusted by homeless, which are a particularly important group of drug users, and inmates. And we're running inmate surveys in Mexico, so we can have estimates from there. Now, other business opportunities. I was happy to be corrected by Licenciado Garay, but the number probably is inaccurate. It surprised me as well. But the amount of the point is that the amount of gasoline being fed from the pipes in Mexico is staggering. We are talking about probably at least $1 billion a year of gas being stolen and distributed illegally. So organized crime is involved in this. Now, I'll get to the... I'm getting into the last part. We have seen a lot of organizations getting into the business of kidnapping, human trafficking, retail, drug sales, etc., etc. And I will say that these are probably not the large organizations that really command that or direct or manage these operations, but there are cells, gangs, small drug trafficking organization. I would like to use the word alpha organization or beta or gamma organizations. I would say alpha organizations do not, it's not in their best interest if they control the drug international flow to get into this. These are small organizations linked to large organizations, but not necessarily working, but probably working autonomously at times, and getting extra rents in addition to the pay or the salaries they receive from the large organization for service provided. Now, the critical part here is that this we didn't have 10 years ago. We have them now, and we didn't have, at least in the size or the magnitude of the problems, it was not near resemblance to what's going on now and at the turn of the century. And the question is why? Why we do have such an explosion of criminality and such an explosion of small groups running all kind of criminal activities? Well, I think it's belonged to the impunity side of the equation. The inability of the criminal justice system to at least pose a minimal deterrence on the people. I gave this morning another example of this. Let's say 40,000 people were executed or killed over the last 5 years. Well, we have documented about 1,000 criminal investigations that move beyond the initial step of open a case, because every person, every body found needs to be, registered as an open case. But most of them, let's say 39,000, do not transcend that step. Then we do have 1,000 investigations out of the 40,000. From those 1,000 investigations, indictment were, or at least serious investigation, were done on 300 cases. And convictions we only have 22 convictions out of 40,000 killings. So this is the complete collapse of the criminal justice system. Here is Luis Pasarak, expert in judicial reform in Latin America, and he can tell, he can explain much better than I do. But this is a complete non-functional system that cannot investigate properly, it cannot process cases, and we cannot pose any kind of deterrence on people. So that failure of the criminal justice system that includes police, and it's a very complex matter, compound with the proliferation of groups and gangs, has produced a staggering and large market of criminality that is posed that kind of threat to the Mexican state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcelo. And we'll turn now to Mark Kleiman. I was fumbling over the name of your books, and I forgot to mention your recent article in Foreign Affairs that if you have not read it, I think is really important to pick up and read. Surgical Strikes in the Drug Wars, Smarter Policies for Both Sides of the Border. And that was in the September issue, I believe, of Foreign Affairs. So much of what you say now is from that, but thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric. And thanks to all of you for coming out. I was especially pleased by the opening introduction, where Eric said that we'd be hearing from two experts and me, because my two predecessors actually know something about this idea. I know something about drug dealing and relatively little about Mexico. So I'm going to propose a radical idea, and I want to make it clear that I'm not convinced it's a good idea. It's, as far as I can tell, exactly one more idea than anybody else has about actually reducing Mexican drug violence in the relatively short term. But that doesn't mean it would work. And not to hold you in suspense, the notion is to use focused deterrence to put all of the Mexican drug dealers on notice that the most violent among them will be separated out for destruction. That's economic destruction by taking away their customers. So I'm going to try and tell you a story about how that could be done. Sure, many of you have seen the TV series Yes, Minister about the British government, and one of the key figures in it is Sir Humphrey, the permanent undersecretary, who keeps steering his dim-witted political boss into more useful courses. And at some point, Sir Humphrey offers a syllogism, which it seems to me everyone ought to know because it drives so much of decision-making, not just in London, but in Washington and in Mexico City and other places. And it goes like this: we must do something. This is something. Therefore, we must do this. So I want to warn against that syndrome while proposing what I think is a relatively radical new idea. And what I'm going to propose is not that we do it, but that we work on it, that we staff it out, that we figure out whether it might work. So I want to start by presenting some analytic material that I'm sure of. What I'm going to say for the next roughly 4 minutes is stuff that I'd bet my life on. Then I'm going to say a bunch of stuff that might be true. So, the analytic stuff. It's widely believed that drug dealing and violence are linked, and that belief is substantially true. From that, the following conclusion is drawn, that if we want to reduce violence, we have to increase our drug law enforcement to drive drug dealing down and therefore drive violence down. Right? I think if you talk to people in drug enforcement around the world, they'll say that's what they're doing. I'm here to tell you that that is precisely backwards. The natural tendency of undifferentiated drug law enforcement is to drive up drug trafficking violence. Enforcement drives up prices. Enforcement in places like Mexico, which are source and transit countries, doesn't drive down consumption very much because, as we were just shown, very little of the cost of crack to a crack addict in the U.S. is made up of the cost of cocaine in Mexico. So we drive up the price of cocaine in Mexico. We don't drive consumption down very much because domestic U.S. price doesn't change very much. That means there's more money on the table to fight over. The second thing about increased drug law enforcement is it raises the stakes. Nobody shoots a cop to avoid a 6-month jail sentence for distributing bootleg videos. People do shoot cops to avoid 20-year cocaine trafficking sentences. That makes sense. They also shoot witnesses, and they shoot prosecutors, and they shoot whoever they have to shoot to make sure that when the time comes for somebody to testify against somebody else, it's not them. And, of course, the increased money on the table means that it's more worth both killing and risking being killed to be the dominant player in the market. So we should expect drug enforcement to increase drug-related violence, unless we specifically design drug enforcement to reduce drug-related violence. Right? We're currently doing things that create incentives for violence among market participants. That's the reason that the Mexican drug trafficking organizations frequently sign their homicides. They leave a note on the body saying who did it. Well, they do that because they want to be known as violent. They think it's economically advantageous to them to be known as violent, as more violent than their rivals, and therefore you get this competitive increase in violence, which you saw in those graphs. If drug law enforcement were focused not on whoever's selling the largest quantity of drugs or whoever's easiest to make a case against, but instead focused on whoever's doing violence, you could radically reduce the amount of violence in drug markets. This has been demonstrated in the U.S. Second analytic proposition. Drug enforcement in Mexico does not much shrink drug abuse in the U.S. That's the same argument from before. So the two things we think we're doing with drug law enforcement and asking the Mexican government to do with respect to drug law enforcement: reducing violence and reducing drug abuse. Neither of them is the natural consequence of what we're doing. It's a little bit like looking for your keys where the light is good rather than where you lost them. By the way, just in the spirit of the cross-cultural impetus behind the Wilson Center, I should point out that Joe Bazooka story was first told about Mullah Nasruddin in 10th century Iran and reprinted in the Arabian Nights. So Joe's in good company. Drug law enforcement folks know how to arrest people and put them in prison. And at least on the U.S. side of the border, we're very good at that. We have 500,000 drug dealers behind bars. It's natural to think that doing what you're good at is useful in the world. But that doesn't always make it true. If it's true that drug enforcement doesn't generally decrease violence or generally decrease drug abuse, then we should probably be doing less of it. But we should be taking whatever amount of it we're going to do and focus it on reducing violence. That is to say, we should ask our law enforcement agencies to do the law enforcement job of protecting public safety and order, rather than making them surrogates in a public health campaign to reduce drug abuse, which is they're not good at and which is not their natural role. We could substantially reduce the amount of drug violence in Mexico if some other route took over from Mexico as the way to get drugs into the U.S. And so Mexico did not have much of a drug trafficking problem into the U.S. back when most of the marijuana and most of the cocaine came directly from Colombia into South Florida via the Caribbean. The Mexican problem was substantially invented by the U.S. government by putting all those military resources into the Caribbean and making the Caribbean route unusable. So that's a policy triumph with its own side effects. As I believe it was James Q. Wilson who said, the chief cause of problems is solutions. What we know about enforcement generally, and this is the topic of when brute force fails, is that concentrated enforcement is more effective than dispersed enforcement. You can't threaten everybody everywhere about everything. Zero tolerance is a slogan of zero intelligence and zero chance to work. You can, on the other hand, have focused zero tolerance. The police and the prosecutors and the courts can decide precisely what it is that they're not going to tolerate any of and communicate that directly to the people otherwise likely to do it. Hey, you, this is what you're doing that we don't want you doing anymore. And here's what's going to happen to you if you keep doing it. Turns out that that sort of threat is tremendously effective. Instead, we generally just have huge enforcement efforts that create tiny probabilities of arrest for any particular criminal act. The chance, Jonathan Calkins computed, that the chance of being arrested in the course of an individual cocaine deal at retail are 1 in 15,000. The kind of people who worry about 1 in 15,000 chances of bad events do not become street cocaine dealers. One more factual submission. Mexico's law enforcement capacity has grown over the last 5 years and can be expected to grow into the future. But 22 convictions out of 40,000 homicides suggest that Mexican law enforcement capacity remains limited. U.S. law enforcement capacity, of course, is always limited, but limited at a much higher level. At any one time, there are 500,000 people behind bars for drug dealing in the U.S. The largest single cost of being in the drug dealing business in the United States is the risk of getting caught, going to prison, losing your drugs, losing your assets. Plus, of course, all the things you do not to get caught. So DEA and its state and local allies have the capacity to impose substantial costs on the drug dealing business. Peter Reuter and I, a long time ago, wrote an article called Risks and Prices, where he explained how increased drug law enforcement would drive drug prices up and therefore drive drug consumption down. It has been said that there is no sadder sight in the world than a beautiful and innocent theory slaughtered by a gang of unruly facts. But since we wrote that article, the number of drug dealers in the U.S. has gone up a factor of 30, from 15,000 to 450 to 500,000. The prices of heroin and cocaine have gone down by about 90% each. But we do have a lot of capacity. And therefore, if we want to put pressure on Mexican drug dealing organizations to reduce their violence, if we want to create disincentives for drug violence in Mexico, the best place to do it is probably in the U.S. Those organizations, as the numbers we just saw suggest, get most of their revenues, not all of them, but most of them, from selling drugs to the U.S. We can deprive them of their U.S. market as a consequence for extreme violence. Then we can change their behavior. Now, we can't deprive all of them of their market at once. The amount of drugs that flow through Mexico to the U.S. has almost nothing to do with what goes on in Mexico. It's entirely a U.S. phenomenon. Depends on how many people there are in the U.S. willing to sell drugs and how many people there are willing to buy drugs and how much they want to buy. Again, aside from some other source country, right, aside from reestablishing the Colombian route to South Florida, Mexico is going to have flow through its territory exactly whatever drugs Americans want to use. And therefore, the continued U.S. demand to the Mexican government, do something about your drug flow north, is like saying, do something about the fact that the sun's going to rise in the east tomorrow morning. It's simply not possible to do that, and it's an old moral principle that ought implies can. It cannot be the duty of the Mexican government to perform the impossible. And unfortunately, not just U.S. drug policy, but the entire world drug control mechanism, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the International Narcotics Control Board, are all based around the idea that somehow enforcement can reduce drug flows. So Oxford insists on calling our book Drugs and Drug Policy What Everyone Needs to Know. In retrospect, this wasn't our intention. We decided that we really should have called it Drugs and Drug Policy, all the false things we wish you'd stop believing. There's nothing really wrong with international drug policy except that all of its premises are false. So that's the theory, and I'll stand by the theory. I mean, those analytic propositions I think are sound, and I don't lose any sleep over whether I'm giving people good advice about that. Now's the stuff I'm not sure of. So here, hypothesis. There used to be 6, now maybe a dozen major drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. But it's still true that 6 of them, maybe 7, far outpace the rest in exports to the U.S. Imagine that the Mexican government were to designate one of those organizations as the most violent, and that the U.S. and the Mexican governments were to collaborate in focusing their drug enforcement attention on that most violent organization. Now, I would claim that the designation should not be made arbitrarily. And both U.S. and Mexico, more or less, have said Los Zetas is the nastiest organization. So if you look at the U.S. transnational organized crime strategy, it mentions Los Zetas by name. Mexico hasn't been quite so explicit, but it's pretty clear that there's now a coordinated effort between the Mexican government and the Sinaloa group to take down Los Zetas. And that may indeed be the right target. But I say it hasn't been chosen in the right way. The choice process ought to be transparent and open, and the choice and the reason for the choice ought to be publicly announced. In fact, I would announce the choice process in advance. I would say, we are now, over the next 3 months, going to pick the most dangerous drug trafficking organization, and here are the criteria we're going to use. You do it very simply by simply counting homicides. That would depend on the capacity of the Mexican government to identify which group was responsible for which killing. But you might not want to treat every killing as the same. You might want to say that the killing of an ordinary citizen is a bigger problem than the killing of another drug dealer, and the killing of a police officer, a mayor, a candidate for governor, or a journalist is a more serious problem. That terroristic acts, I believe it was in Monterrey, that whichever organization was trying to move in decapitated 6 of the leaders of the rival organization and rolled out the heads on the dance floor of the biggest local disco on Saturday night. I'm going to say that's not 6 killings. That's much more important than 6 killings. That is a terrorist act. That's a deliberate threat to the capacity of the state to protect its citizens. So we might want to upgrade those things compared to ordinary killings. Or, and this is a suggestion really that came from Alejandro this morning, maybe we don't want to do a total count. Maybe we just don't want to announce that we're waiting for the next spectacular crime. Whoever does the next crime that's worth headlines will be our target. Imagine we picked the target. Now what? The U.S. drug enforcement machinery announces through its network of informants, but also publicly, that the Mexican government has chosen, let's imagine, Los Templarios as the target organization. The Drug Enforcement Administration believes, accurately or not, that it can attribute to every U.S. distributor a Mexican source. So if they put out the word, we know which organizations are getting their drugs from Los Templarios. And unless they stop getting their drugs from Los Templarios, we're going to target them in preference to other U.S. drug distributors. Again, law enforcement is the biggest cost confronting a drug distribution organization. If you say we're concentrating as much as we can of that cost on the customers of Los Templarios, all of those people will look for a new source. In this sense, the fact that the distributor in Baltimore who was selling Sinaloa organization drugs said Sinahu is actually a plus and not a minus. He doesn't care where he gets his drugs from. If he doesn't know where he gets his drugs from, well, he can be told. So if I'm right about the way this thing works, we make that announcement, and in a matter of weeks, the target organization is out of business. Not because we arrested everybody and put them in prison, which we don't have the capacity to do, but because they don't have any customers. The example here is the American Mafia and cocaine distribution. Late 1970s, early 1980s, the Mafia families were the most important criminal organizations in America. The cocaine business was the largest criminal market in the history of the world, and the Mafia never got a piece of it. They were so much the focus of enforcement, particularly by the FBI, but also by the DEA, that nobody wanted to buy from them or sell to them because it was just too risky. So we had a huge cocaine market, and the Mafia families never made any money off it. And they have been substantially diminished over time. So I claim it is possible to selectively freeze out even quite competent criminal organizations from a market that they really want by giving them the case of commercial leprosy, such that nobody else wants to touch them. So now imagine we've done all of that. Notice we're doing a lot of imagining in this process. Imagine we've done all of that and we've taken down Los Templarios. We haven't destroyed any drug trafficking capacity. As Alejandro said, these are not hierarchical organizations. All of the people now bringing drugs into the U.S. working for them, tomorrow will be bringing drugs into the U.S. working for somebody else. As my teacher Mark Moore used to say, the drug business is much more like the movie business than it is like the car manufacturing business. It's not that there are these long-term, stable, hierarchical, centrally commanded organizations. There's groups of people with different capacities who come together largely on an ad hoc basis around particular projects. But that's okay. We weren't trying to reduce drug smuggling. We were trying to punish one organization for its excessive violence. So we've now got a new set of drug dealing organizations, not including our original target. By hypothesis, we picked the most violent one. So on average, the remaining groups are less violent. And then we announce we're running the contest again. You too could get a designation as the most dangerous organization or the one that does the next horrendous crime, and then we'll put you too out of business. If that works, we've generated a race to the bottom in the rates of violence. Nobody wants to be the most violent organization. At some point, we get to a stage where the level of violence is relatively low. Nobody is noticeably more violent than his rivals. And in effect, we're then holding the U.S. drug trafficking revenues of the remaining Mexican trafficking organizations hostage to their willingness to conduct business in a relatively nonviolent fashion. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But there's a lot of stuff about that story that could be wrong. It may be that we can't correctly identify the perpetrators of violence. It may be that we can now but couldn't after we started the contest, because organizations would start doing false flag violence, trying to frame their rivals for violence. Now, I would claim that if it's currently advantageous to be thought a murderer, and we can make it a situation where it's not thought advantageous to be a murderer, we've made some progress, but still it's a limit on the idea. We're assuming that to some extent, at least some of the organizations have the capacity to control violence by their members. When you look at drug dealing violence in the U.S., it's mostly not strategic. It's mostly two young guys who are in the drug dealing business and therefore heavily armed, who have a dispute about who looked funny at whose girlfriend, and somebody winds up dead. And as Peter Reuter said this morning, part of the reason there's less drug trafficking violence in the U.S. now than there was 20 years ago is that 40-year-olds don't kill each other as often as 20-year-olds do. And the drug dealers have aged with the market. Still, if it turns out that one of the big organizations in Mexico can't control its members, well, maybe we want to destroy that one and give preference to the organizations that can or learn to control their members. Those of you who follow domestic U.S. law enforcement will recognize this as an application of the David Kennedy ceasefire strategy. That's how he reduced gang violence in Boston and how Charlie Beck reduced it in Los Angeles. Simply saying to the gangs, you know, whoever does the next killing, we're going to take down. Can't take them all down at once. Can take them down one at a time. Would there be blowback in Mexico? Right? Will one of the organizations say, well, you want to come after us? We'll come after you, and start doing genuine terroristic violence, putting bombs in marketplaces, to essentially say to the Mexican government, no, you can't do this to us. There would matter a lot that it's actually being done by the U.S. government, which is likely to be less amenable to such pressure. Is there blowback in the U.S.? Right now, there's very little violence related to Mexican drug dealing in the United States. Juarez is one of the most dangerous cities in the New World, and El Paso across the border is one of the safest. If we decided to take down one of the big Mexican drug traffickers, would they start killing people in the U.S.? They might. Could the target organization survive without U.S. drug revenues? Would they do domestic Mexican drug dealing and extortion and kidnapping and stealing gasoline from Pemex? Maybe. Hard to believe that it's just an accident that all of the organizations doing a lot of violence are also selling drugs into the U.S. But it may be that it wouldn't work because the target organization, particularly Los Zetas, which was never really a drug dealing organization, they were just a violence organization, could figure out some other way to be usefully violent. What that says to me is that somebody who, unlike me, is actually an expert on Mexico, for example, who speaks Spanish, or preferably a team of smart people, ought to get together and spend 3 or 6 months figuring this out. I think we've got an idea here. Might be a good idea, might be a terrible idea. 6 months staff work would probably tell us which, or at least give us a better idea. And since, as I say, I think it's the only idea currently on the table that might substantially reduce Mexican drug violence over the next 6 months, I think we ought to give it a shot. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. I think I've never been so happy to be wrong. You are indeed an expert, Mark.
Not on this stuff.
Okay, well, we have, I think, 45 minutes for questions. So try to keep your questions brief and wait till they bring a microphone to you. But let's take 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Somebody that I'm not seeing is raising their hand.
Hi, my name is Carla Barquero. I'm from the Permanent Mission of Canada to the OAS. Thank you very much for your presentations. I have a PhD and I work for the government. So I guess my purview usually is trying to use research like this to answer questions, because I think that's what we need to be doing here, especially when you're working for an organization like we are. I think it's very interesting, some of the comments we made today, particularly looking at this from very different angles from what we traditionally see. I guess one of my main concerns is that governments have much more to look at than just violence in Mexico. They have to worry about the health of their citizens. You mentioned that this might be a better way to isolate these issues and focus on them separately, but governments don't always have the luxury of doing that. And so my question becomes, if we were to propose something like this, how would we sell it to the American public, for instance, when they're worried also about the levels of death from drugs and the amount of people that are addicted?
Anyone else? Yep, over here. Alex, there's one right back there.
I wanted to. My name is Aaron Terrazas from the Migration Policy Institute. I wanted to ask Dr. Kleiman. There's been several references to the shift of the drug trade over the past 20 years from the Caribbean route to Mexico, and now, likely to Central America in response to Mexico's efforts. Kind of given the scenario you described, what would you say would be the implications for Central America?
Okay, and we have one over here. Well, why don't we go here since you're the closest, and then we'll do another round. Yeah, right here. Oh, all right.
Hi, my name is Susan Minushkin. I'm at Management Systems International.
Where?
Management Systems International. I have a question about this focus strategy. It seems like your strategy is designed to reduce drug violence, but the war on drugs started before there was violence, and its goal was more to prevent the drug trafficking organizations from undermining or continuing to undermine the capacity of the state. So would your solution, and since you're not a Mexican expert, maybe Marcelo, my former colleague, or some of the others on the panel can answer it, would the solution that you propose reduce violence in Mexico, which is a worthy, important goal, but at the same time result in a back to the future strategy where the government ignores the drug trafficking organizations, pacts with them essentially that as long as you don't cause any trouble at home, we'll let you go? And would the consequences of that be an undermining of the capacity of the federal, state, and municipal governments, making them essentially narco governments?
Okay. Most of it
Okay, so let me take the second question first, just because it's unlike the other two. I don't see Central America as replacing Mexico. It's true that some of the activity is moving to Central America, but all that stuff's going to come through Mexico. At least so far, I haven't seen any evidence of anything coming straight to the U.S. There is a serious question about whether Mexican capacity ought to be refocused away from its northern border and to its southern border. And I just don't know enough about those countries and how the drug dealing operates there. What's pretty clear to me, having talked to people who know Central America, is that it's the land route into Mexico that's the most problematic. And the stuff we're coming into Mexico by sea, that would probably be, particularly if we're coming straight from South America, that would be much less problematic. So that might be the way out for Northern Central America. But I can't say much more than that. Yes, of course, governments want to defend their populations against drug abuse. That's the reason we have drug laws. The question is whether increased enforcement, particularly increased source and transit country enforcement, has any capacity to actually protect people against drug use. And I think the overwhelming evidence is that it does not. If we wanted to reduce drug abuse in the U.S., we should focus on the fact that most of the people with serious drug abuse problems are also criminally active in ways that get them arrested and are therefore likely to be on bail, on probation, or on parole. The Hawaii Hope Project has demonstrated that you can take a group of seriously addicted people, criminally active methamphetamine users on felony probation with an average of 14 prior arrests, and get 80% of them to be non-methamphetamine users and in compliance with their probation at 1 year. No drug treatment program in the world can do that. And the way to do it is by, again, focused deterrence. So you're going to be drug tested at random. Every time you're dirty, you're going to jail for 2 days. And it turns out lots of people who don't get better with mere drug treatment get better if the alternative to not using is jail. And most of them get better pretty quickly. The modal number of arrests for drug use in that group is 1 in the course of a year. So Angela Hawken at Pepperdine has a number of evaluations on that. We've now got replications going in several places. If that were U.S. national policy, we would have much less drug abuse, we would have much less crime, we'd have fewer people in prison, and Mexico would be selling less drugs to the U.S. because those folks are the backbone of drug demand. The casual middle-class employed drug user that Bill Bennett crusaded against accounts for about 20% of drug consumption. 80% of drug consumption is people with serious drug abuse or drug addiction problems. And again, they mostly wind up in the criminal justice population. So that's what I do on that side. Part of the reason I want a transparent selection process is to avoid going back to the old corrupt bargain. There would be no promise here that drug dealers who weren't the most violent would be immune from law enforcement. There'd merely be a promise that whoever is the most violent would be targeted for destruction. Again, not primarily by arrest and conviction, but by loss of market. Given the rising level of cocaine abuse in Mexico, it seems to me if I were running Mexican drug law enforcement, I'd be worried very substantially about domestic distribution and not about protecting the northern border. But again, if I thought this were going to increase drug abuse in the U.S., I'd be worried, but I don't. And I think that forcing the Mexican drug trafficking organizations to stop using systemic violence as a means of challenging the state is a good way of strengthening rather than weakening state power. On the other hand, if you really want to strengthen state power in Mexico, which I think you do, then you need judicial reform, you need police reform. Mostly what that means is you need better salaries for the cops. You look at the salaries of Mexican police, and it's obvious that any discussion about doing serious law enforcement has to be a joke. If you're not paying your police enough to maintain a decent lifestyle honestly, you're asking them to steal, and they will. And I think what Mexico needs is fewer cops paid better, which is a formula that seems to have worked very well in the Republic of Georgia. And, the moving from the civil law closed trial to a common law open trial is probably a good idea, though as far as I can tell, the work to make that possible hasn't really been done. I mean, Chile decided to do that, safety, and he said, you want public safety, I need another 2% of GDP. That's the price. You want to pay it or not? And the answer was, no, we'll have our gated communities instead. Well, that turned out not to be such a great strategy. So maybe it's time to have the Tea Party stop running Mexico as well as the U.S.
Alejandro, you want to say anything about Central America?
Yeah, well,
Or anything
I mean, Central America in and by itself does not substitute Mexico. It should be quite clear of that. It complements Mexico to the extent it is. I mean, Guatemala is only useful for drug traffickers to the extent that they can access Mexican land routes from there. And ultimately, I mean, in a very cynical type of statement, let me just say this. In terms of Mexican national interest, the best policy would be to let, airplanes land like 100 meters from the border, then take a tunnel. That would be pretty much optimal policy for on the Mexican national interest. That is, of course, if we weren't dealing with the U.S. in lots of other fora. Are there some things that we can do for Central America? Yes, we could, for instance, redo some of the air and maritime interdiction we have been doing in the southern border. We could do it pretty much tomorrow if we wanted. the U.S. wouldn't like it, but anyway, that would help Guatemala, and that would help Honduras. We could also help if we had some migration reform in Mexico that allowed some of the Central Americans to move through the country without being undocumented. We might also do that. Anyway, but otherwise, I mean, it's probably Central America's role will probably continue to increase to the extent that it's still the easiest route from the Andes to the U.S.
Just a word to add to that. The pieces of the U.S. government that face Mexico on this issue, INL at the State Department, DEA, are dedicated to reducing drug flows, much more than the rest of the U.S. government is. So I think it's important not to confuse what the DEA says with what the U.S. government wants. I mean, speaking now as a U.S. nationalist with sort of very minimal bleeding heart modifications, just so very crudely from the U.S. national interest, the notion that there's anything about the drug flow to the U.S. that's 2% as important to us as protecting the Mexican state from what's happening right now is insane. Our big stake in Mexico is Mexico, not drugs.
Okay, there were a couple more questions over here on this side. Alex?
Yeah, I was struck by.
Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, sorry. My name is Ed Newton. I'm a journalist working for various publications. I'm a freelance journalist. And I was struck by how little we know about these so-called cartels. Where the money's going, where the profits are going. Is there that much of a profit? Why are they so destructive? What's their motivation? And I'm not sure if this is a function of the actual decentralization of drug business in Mexico, or is it just lack of knowledge? Sometimes I get the impression that we're we've sent this vehicle up to Mars, and we're like trying to draw conclusions, from various instruments. And I guess the question is like, what have we learned anecdotally about these guys? Is there a Valachi out there who has spilling some of the beans about what's happening internally? Are there brave undercover officers who have gone into these organizations and don't learn anything? Is there anecdotal stuff, valuable anecdotal material about which can tell us about what's actually going on beneath the surface here?
You want to respond to that, Alejandro? No. Okay, we're going to take a couple more. I think there was one more behind you there, right? Was there a question there? Oh, they've asked the question. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. Íñigo Guevara. I'm a Mexican writer and analyst. I see that we've been putting a lot of resources and attention through the whole cycle from the production to the consumption. And we've been putting our best minds, our best people, frankly, at interdiction, at eradication, of tackling the production and the trafficking and the distribution side. Every time someone talks about consumption, the room quiets. You mentioned something about the Hawaii Action Group. I was wondering, what if we take, since this seems to be a forum for imagination and new proposals, what if we take our fight to the consumer? What if we involve one of the best agencies in the States, for example, the IRS, the most feared, without a doubt, and somehow link consumers that have, I don't know whether it would be implementing a three-stripe policy, but that chronic consumer base, which is said to be about 5% of the U.S. population. about 2.4% of the Mexican population, which is roughly 20 million people, and go after that, seizing their assets and using those assets to fund the rest of the fight. Thanks.
Is there one more question? Okay. You want to start on the first one there, Alejandro?
Maybe
And Marcelo then can also.
Well, on whether what we know about the internal workings of the cartels, there are some sources that you can go to. Over 100,000 people that are somehow related to the cartels have been detained, at least for a short period of time. There's a lot of depositions that have been taken from those people. There are some depositions that are available from some of the kingpins or people higher up in the organization. So we know something about what goes on here. And there are also some ethnographic work, and there are some sources that you can actually take a look at. I think the crucial point is that not all organizations are alike. There is significant organizational diversity. Some are more decentralized than others. I would argue, for instance, that the Zetas are highly decentralized, and some of their cells are pretty much self-financing units that kick some of the money upstairs, but that's it. Some others, maybe the Templarios, are probably a bit more hierarchical and centralized. So I don't think you can draw very general conclusions about this. Of course, there are similarities in terms of how they conduct some of their businesses, because best practices tend to flow from one organization to the next. But we still don't have, the level of detail that, for instance, the Colombians had at some point in the late 90s or earlier part of last decade. But I think we're getting there. We're getting there in terms of what we know and don't know about the organizations. No sé, Marcelo. No?
Okay. I think the second question was.
Yeah. The problem is that the people who are heavy drug users mostly don't file tax returns. And it's the heavy drug users and not the casual drug users that account for the bulk of consumption. So it makes sense to squeeze down on drug use by probationers. I know of no serious idea about squeezing down on drug use by the much larger number of very light users that constitute the rest of the market. There certainly aren't anything like 5 million heavy users. We're dealing with a couple of million, and we know how to get to them. If you want to address the sort of larger drug abuse problem, certainly the most cost-effective thing to do is what's called screening, brief intervention, referral treatment. If asking about drug use were part of a routine annual physical, and the people who indicated they were, had some kind of problem, were counseled by their physician, that's really quite a lot of cocaine to be using. You should cut back on that. And here's a treatment number. That's not very effective, but it's very cost-effective. The good news is that both that and massive increases in community treatment resources are built into the structure of healthcare reform. So we're going to get out when Obamacare takes effect in 2014. The capacity of the country for drug treatment is way up, but drug treatment is really quite modestly effective. It's effective enough to be worth its effort, but we shouldn't expect any substantial kick out of that.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. I don't know if there are any final comments from our panelists. Well, thank you all very, very much for coming. We appreciate our panelists and what the ideas they put forward. And thank you.
Thanks.